Welcome, everybody. Thank you ever so much for turning up on this bright, sunny evening by UK standards anyway. And we're glad to welcome Mike Wolfe from all the way from America, Pennsylvania, who's going to be doing building ribbon interfaces in code, or BRIC, as I abbreviated it to. And without further ado, Mike, if you are ready, please would you start sharing your screen now, and over to you.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, as Colin said, my talk today is on building ribbon interfaces with code. And before I get started, I just want to thank Colin and Alessandro Grimaldi for giving me the opportunity to present you with today's topic. For those of you who don't know, my name is Mike Wolfe. I write daily articles about Access and VBA at nolongerset.com. And I've written over 650 articles since September 2020. Quick summary of my background. I graduated from West Point, the US Military Academy in 2002 with a bachelor's degree in computer science. And I've been developing in Microsoft Access and SQL Server now for the past 15 years. For the last 6 years, I've been running Grandin & Braverman, which is a software development company here in Pennsylvania that specializes in Microsoft Access solutions. And I was named Microsoft MVP in November of last year. So with that out of the way, we'll jump right into the outline, what we're going to cover today. And so we're going to start with why write your ribbon in code in the first place? Why not just use a third-party editor? What we need to do to build the XML, importing and displaying custom images, and enabling and disabling, and also showing and hiding buttons using callbacks. I'll keep this part pretty brief. So there's a few different reasons why I end up not using a graphical editor. There's a few different options available. Kevin Bell has one over at AccessUI.com. Gunter Avenius has one that's very well regarded. And there are a few other commercial ones. I think Microsoft had one that they released as part of the Office 2007 release. I believe I tried that early on, and I wasn't impressed with it. And I don't know a lot of people that use that one directly. There's a few different things. As if you've read a lot of my stuff, you know I'm really big into version control with Microsoft Access. And one of the issues with XML specifically is that it's very tolerant of whitespace changes. So for the most part, the XML will ignore any whitespace changes that you have in there. But most of the popular version control systems, Git, Mercurial, which is what I use, they see any white space change as a change in content. And so you can end up with a bunch of false positives in your version control. So that was one reason I avoided that. The other is just the development speed. There's a certain amount of context switching that takes place. So if you're writing ribbon code, using a third-party graphical editor, then you're switching to that editor and then coming back into the code. And you're just switching back and forth between those two things. I prefer to spend a lot of my time in code. For the same reason, I don't use a lot of action query definitions. Any of my update and delete and append queries, I pretty much generate those in code as well, using similar techniques to what I'm going to do here with the Ribbon XML. The other thing is that there's no external dependencies. So you're not relying on a third party. You don't have to worry if there's a bug in your third-party tool someday, or if there's some feature that they don't implement. You're not waiting on somebody else. There's no licensing costs, although I think the licensing costs for most of the third-party editors are pretty reasonable, and certainly it's well worth the amount that they charge to save time from writing the XML by hand. But once you've got this class module in behind it, there's a lot of complexity that's in the class module, but in the actual calling code, as you're going to see, there's really not very much complexity. It's pretty fast to write the individual code to build a ribbon. And then the last thing is generating dynamic content. So there's a handful of different gallery controls, they call them in the ribbon, and that includes things like dropdowns, combo boxes, and there's another one. There's like an image gallery type thing. And so you can use those third-party tools to generate dynamic content, but the way that gets done, generally speaking, is that you use Callback. And to create a dynamic list box dropdown, using callbacks, it requires 3 or 4 different callbacks, and you have to kind of synchronize all of them. It's a fair amount of additional work and stuff that you have to do to to keep it all straight. And I'll show you what it looks like later on with this technique. It's very simple. You go through a loop and you have one line of code for each button that you want to add, each item that you want to add to your dropdown. Getting into actually building the custom ribbon XML. Essentially, at a high level, what I'm doing is I'm using a class module to generate the ribbon XML string on the fly. And then I use a LoadUI method of the Access application module to actually load the ribbon. One of the concepts that I embraced with this is that I only implemented what I needed. So the ribbon class that I'm going to demonstrate today doesn't currently support every feature of the ribbon, but I think you'll see enough of what it does support that any additional features that you wanted to add should be pretty straightforward. The code is fairly well commented. So let me, I'll go through these real quick. So when we construct the XML, we're actually doing it from the inside out, and that'll be a little bit more obvious when we switch over to the code and I show you what it's doing. And again, all the complexity is in the class module. So the actual calling code is pretty straightforward and very readable. And then to actually load this UI, most of the Access applications that have ribbons, they store the ribbon code in that is it the USys ribbons table. There's a system table, a user system table, and they get stored in there. You don't have to store it in that table. You can actually load the ribbon XML on the fly using the application LoadUI method. Let me switch over to my sample database. Right now, this is just the first tab is named main, and we've got a button here that opens a report. And this is a custom print preview contextual ribbon that we'll get in a little bit more detail later. We can show this secret message. That secret message that only appears. Okay, I'll show you how we can hide this using a callback here in a second. And then we've got a couple of an about form that has attributions for the custom icons. Okay, so let's go into the actual code. Okay, so that first ribbon, this is the entirety of the code to run that entire ribbon. And as you can see, each button on the ribbon is just a single line of code. If we go to that first one and do this so that we can look at the ribbon at the same time. So this first mailing labels button that's in here, preview report button. And the first thing that I'm passing to it is the button image. The class module is pretty tolerant about what you pass to that. So you can pass, in this case, this is a ID MSO text. This is the button that shows in the command for turning the reading pane off. And then we have the caption that appears, mailing labels. In this case, for this particular method, we're previewing a report. So I show the report name, and then this here is the ribbon control size, which can be either large or regular. Inherit and none are used for different things. But for the most part, if we want it to be large, we specify that. By default, it's going to show a smaller one. And the difference in terms of the icon dimensions, the large icons are 32 by 32. The smaller icons are 16 by 16. And you'll get a sharper image if you use an icon that's in that native resolution, so that Microsoft Access doesn't have to do any kind of resampling of the image. Right, so this second one, here's an example of a custom icon, and I'll show you how I load this into my system in a little while. And again, the message there. Now so for the button method, again, you start with the image and then the caption. So most of these ribbon items start with the image and caption. Those are pretty much required for every kind of button that we're showing. And then for a plain button, we have a callback function. You can use an actual callback function, or in this case, you can call a public function directly in there. The only thing you have to be aware of is that, in order to replace the quotes, I use the quote symbol from XML. Now, if you wanted to, you could use like a backtick in there and then do a replace. Might be a little bit more readable. Honestly, I don't do very much of this anyway. I just wanted to throw it in here as an example to show you something that you could do with it. And then here's that get visible callback. And again, this is going to be really small to see here. All the different optional parameters that are in there. But we've got the button image, the caption, and the callback function, which are all required for that button. method call, and then the button size, which defaults to the smaller icon. And then we've got optional callbacks to make the button enabled or disabled, make it visible or invisible. If we want this to be a toggle button, where when we click the button, it stays toggled down, we can just pass a single Boolean, set that to true, and it'll make it a toggle button. The key tip is that's when you press Alt, and then here we go, P, you can assign custom key tips to all the different icons. So that's something that I did here in this print preview ribbon. Okay, so once we've finished adding all of the buttons that we want for a particular group, then we just have to call this close group method and then give it the name that we want for the group. So this is a reports group. So we have two function calls here to add the preview report button, plain button, and then we close the group using this close group method. And then we immediately just start adding buttons to the next group. And when we're done adding buttons to that next group, then we close that group as well. This is actually a group that we don't see because of the visible callback. And then the third group is the help group. And here you see the change data source and the about button. And then when we're done with that, this is our final group that we're going to define. Then we close the whole tab. And then you give it the name of the tab there at the end. So that's kind of what I mean by building inside out, whereas normally, intuitively, you would think that you'd start with the name of the tab, but because of the way that we're wrapping the XML and the way we're building it, it just makes more sense to do it this way in terms of the implementation. But it's not all that difficult to do, and I think it's still pretty readable. So that's the first tab, and then this next tab here is the configuration tab. And one of the things that I have on there is a dropdown. And so here's the three different configuration forms. So if we've got, I use this technique a lot with these kinds of things. If I've got a set of, maybe half a dozen or a dozen lookup forms that the users should be able to configure, if it's product types, or, in this case we've got account types, here's product category. This is a way that you can keep it pretty compact, so and it's also very easy to expand this, and it doesn't, you're not filling your ribbon with a bunch of configuration forms that the users are, maybe only going to use once or twice a year. You can keep them all easily accessible, but buried inside of that drop-down list. And so this is what I was talking about in that previous slide about how easy it is to build these kind of dynamic lists. The list I have here is actually in this local config form lookup table, and what I have is just the caption that I want to appear up here, and then the name of the form that it's going to open. So if I wanted to expand this, I could create a new form. And maybe, and the sequence determines where it appears. Okay, now I do have to, in this case, I can't just refresh the ribbon, because it's gonna, if I rebuild the XML itself, we would end up with duplicate XML ribbons. For it to pick up this new entry that I added, I'm gonna have to actually close and reopen the database. For the most part, that's not an issue, and you do have the option, if you wanted to make it populated with callback functions, that you could get around that. But now here's the new type. And I didn't actually make any changes to it. I just copied that other one, but it is the edit new type form. So that's where you can see, you can, once we've built that here in the ribbon, we've added this in here, then it's kind of self-updating, and you don't have to do anything additional to add additional configuration forms. You just update that one table. Anyway, so that's that. Okay, so then the final thing after we close that tab, the configuration tab there, and then we do call this Ribbon.LoadRibbon. And what that does is that wraps the final XML tag around it. So let me just show you quick what that looks like. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to uncomment this. Just build the ribbon again, and then we'll open that up. So one of the things that I like about the way I've got this built is that I built in the leading white space and the indenting so that if you need to troubleshoot and look at the XML, it's very readable. You can see all of the attributes for each button. You can see how everything is built. The other thing that you do when you're creating these ribbons, and if you've had to create ribbons by hand, you probably know this, that every one of these ribbon elements has to have a unique ID. And so I build that ID by using some kind of a reasonable name. So in this case, I take the caption and I remove the special characters from it, but then I append a counter to it so that this counter ensures that I don't have any duplicate IDs in the XML. So it's one less thing that you have to worry about. All the graphical ribbon editors will do this for you as well. But if you're writing your XML by hand, that's something that you have to deal with, and it's kind of a pain in the neck to keep it all straight and make sure that you're not ending up with duplicates. Okay, so now the very last step that I'm doing here in code is I'm setting the custom ribbon ID for the application. And this is basically setting a database property. I've written an article about how I do these database properties, but if you come into the options and you look at the current database, come down here. So this is the ribbon name. And that same name is what's being set down here. So any questions so far before we jump into the next part?
There were a couple of questions from Crystal earlier. The first one was whether all HTML codes work in XML, or unquote, as one example.
I don't know for sure. I think if not all, probably most of them, because I think HTML is itself like a subset of XML. So I think most of those codes are the same. But as I said, for the most part, pretty unusual that I actually embed these in here. Most of the time, I don't need to do that. If I'm doing anything that would involve a lot of that kind of text, I would probably do it in a callback function anyway.
Some HTML, of course, wouldn't apply in ribbon code anyway, so sure. It wouldn't matter whether it worked or not. There was also another question from Crystal that somebody else followed up as well about whether it was absolutely necessary to close and reopen the database to alter or remove the custom ribbon. I think you've already answered that, though.
Yeah, so there's a different thing that we do as far as changing the visibility of individual buttons on the ribbon, and that is not something that you need to close and reopen the database for.
Clicking the compact and repair button, of course, will have the same effect.
Right.
Save a couple of seconds, no more, but...
Yeah, so the last slide I've got, I'm going to get into the callback functions. So I think we'll hit that there when we get to that point.
Okay. Any other questions before Mike carries on?
I did have another question. I didn't put Mike in front of it, though. I was wondering if you change the custom ribbon ID, like if you were to find two of them that are almost alike, but the second one is a little different, is that another way to change the ribbon without closing and reopening?
Good question. I don't know if I tested that or not. No, I don't think so. Because when, so the very first time that you run this, it doesn't actually take effect. So it's going to generate, so the ribbon ID is something that, again, you need to distinguish it from any built-in ribbons. So I use GB here as Grand Ribbon. So feel free to use your own prefix there. But I use this prefix of GB ribbon. And then the ribbon ID that I'm actually using is based on the program name, I believe. I think when the ribbon class first starts up, the default ribbon ID is just GB ribbon and then the program name. So this one is ribbon sample, which is why it says ribbon sample.
Might be able to contribute something there.
Sure.
I think that when you call LoadUI, it creates the ribbon and stores it in memory, and it allocates it to a ribbon object. And the LoadUI, the XML itself specifies a callback that it calls to notify you of the object pointer to the ribbon that you've just created. In all the ribbon implementations I've seen, the assumption is there's only going to be one of those. And in fact, I've written code so that it stores those in a collection. So you can have a collection of objects with a key that you can then name each of your ribbons, and that way you can get to multiple ribbons that you've created. I think in all the implementations I've seen, people store that returned object pointer in a global, which then limits you to using a single one. In this case, what Mike's doing is he's storing it as the database property, and Access automatically loads that as the default ribbon at startup.
Yeah, and so the other thing that I did run into is I did end up calling a separate callback function for that main ribbon, because what I was running into is when I created the extra contextual ribbons, that it was clobbering the main ribbon, so that when I went to refresh it, it was looking at the wrong pointer. So that's kind of a down in the weeds detail, but if you look through the sample database after this presentation, you can kind of see what I did there. So is there a way then to answer Crystal's original question? Is there a way to switch on the fly to use a completely different ribbon?
Yes, what happens is that the conventional thing is you store multiple ribbons in the USys ribbons table. In fact, Access doesn't load those until you actually reference one of them. So for example, if you've got a ribbon that a custom ribbon that you've put in USys ribbons, which is used as the ribbon property of a form, it doesn't actually load the UI for that ribbon until you open that form. Then what happens is it sees that you're trying to talk about a ribbon it doesn't know about, so it loads it then. And it's that if those ribbons all share one callback, that's why you lose your pointer to your original ribbon.
So that would be,
you can call LoadUI as many times as you like, and it will create as many ribbons as I don't know how many until it runs out of resources. But it does that and returns a new object to the pointer to that ribbon in the LoadUI callback.
right, but will it update the main ribbon, or is that just for updating the form and report ribbons?
No, I believe it just creates a new one. It doesn't allow you to update an existing one. So in other words, once you've loaded the XML for a ribbon and created it, I don't believe it allows you to change that XML.
Right.
Only use callbacks to invalidate it and change the availability, what you're going on to.
Right, but if I were to say, at runtime, try and switch the ribbon name here. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, that property is only used by Access when it initially loads the database anyway.
Right, but so that's what determines what's shown in this main ribbon.
Yeah.
So I think to answer Crystal's questions, I don't think there's really a way to do that. Yeah, the only other way you could maybe get around that is if you wanted to have if you had a main menu form, or if you had.
No, every form you open has its own unique ribbon defined by the ribbon name property of the form.
Right.
Yeah. If you don't define that, then it doesn't load a ribbon, so your default one's left behind.
Okay. Okay, so let's switch over to, actually, let me change that option back before I forget. Okay, so using built-in images. As I mentioned, there's a couple different ways that you can use images. That ID MSO that I showed at the beginning for the mailing label report, that comes from built-in command within Access. And so there's a couple different ways you can find those. You can use an ID MSO browser, and I would imagine that probably all of the third-party ribbon builders have something like that built in. I was looking last night at Kevin Bell, who has AccessUI.com. He has a ribbon and tree builder in there, and that has a gallery built in. I know Philip Stiefel at one point had a PDF available where he went through and exported all of those icon images along with the ID MSOs that go with them. Another way that you can find these is to just go into to customize the ribbon and then hover over the icon that you want to see. So just demonstrate that quickly. So if I come up here and I say customize the ribbon, and say I wanted to use the clipboard icon. If I hover over that, you can see that show clipboard that shows up. So show clipboard. Just going to save that, and we're going to force it to reload the ribbon. and you can see it brings in the that clipboard icon. So that's the other way you can get to it. What the IDMSO browsers have, they often have a way that you can search to find the kind of icon that you're looking for. One big caveat to doing this is if you're using an icon that goes along with a command that's different than whatever the command is that you want it to represent on your ribbon, that those icons can and do change between Office versions. And usually they're just small stylistic changes, but occasionally it'll be a major change. And so the icon on one version of Office will look a lot different on another version of Office, and it can be very confusing potentially for your user. So you just have to be careful when you use icons that don't go along with commands for their intended purpose. If you're using the icons for their intended purpose, which I'm doing in the print preview ribbon that I'll show you a little bit later, then it makes sense to go ahead and continue using those. You're pretty safe that way. The alternative then to using built-in images would be to use custom images. As I mentioned earlier, the native icon resolution is either 16 by 16 or 32 by 32. I prefer to use PNGs because it's got a alpha transparency channel with 256 levels of transparency, so you can have, it looks really nice. One of the techniques people used early on when the ribbon first came out is they would get an icon and they would just use the background that matched the background for Office. And of course, then if an individual user had a different Office theme, or if it was a different version of Office, then you ended up with this weird gray box that didn't match the new background. So PNG is nice. Unfortunately, it's still in 2022 is not natively supported in Access. So you have to kind of jump through some hoops to be able to actually display them. So I have a couple different URLs that websites that I like to use. So the one that I probably use the most is this icons8.com. Most of the icons there are free for commercial use, but you do have to provide attribution. And so I do that. I just have an about form that I include in my applications. And I think I showed that earlier, but so I've got the attributions there. I've also got the current version number. And then I also include that version number in the caption of the button. So the nice thing about this is when, if I'm pushing out a new version of an application to a client, they don't even have to open the about form. They can just look at this label and see and tell me whether, what version number they're on, and I can confirm that they've got the latest version or not. I'm going to go through the high-level overview, and then I'll show you a quick example of this. So loading custom images, I think the newer versions of Access have a little bit better support for this. When I was first working on this, you had to be really careful that you didn't just load an image file directly into a table, because Access would add a whole bunch of OLE information, and you'd add a 20K file, and it would be like 500K worth of information. It would just, the database would really bloat. So what I do is, instead of loading it as an image, I just load the raw bytes directly into a local table. And as I said, I think there's better support for this now. Colin and I were talking about this the other day, and the main reason that if I were starting over from scratch, I might use one of those other methods, but I already had this built. It works well, and it doesn't bloat the database. So, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So that's why I do it this way. But if you wanted to start over from scratch, there might be other ways to load those things and keep them in like the shared resources. When we load that file, what we're doing is we're passing the file name to a callback function via a tag. So let me come back in here. So here's that secret message. And this is using a custom icon that I downloaded. And you can see it's passing it in the tag of the XML. Now, if you remember in the actual code, I'm not mentioning anything about the tag there. That's just getting done right here. This button code is looking, and when it builds the attributes for the element, it sees that there's a .png file extension, and it knows that that's a custom icon that's been embedded in a local table. And so it puts that in the tag. And then there's a callback function, get image. So this get ribbon image callback function is what gets called inside the code. So if we come over here, you can see an example of that callback function. And all it's passing is the ribbon control, and this by ref parameter here. This is how we pass the image back to Access to actually display it. And so you have to set that in iPicture format. And so I've got a function that extracts the file from this local table and uses a handful of GDI plus Windows API calls to convert that from a PNG into an iPicture compatible format. So you see that there's a fair amount of stuff that's kind of happening behind the scenes here. If we go back in here, it's looking up a saved PNG in the table, returning it as an iPicture object. So we're getting the individual bits that were saved to the table and then converting those bits from a byte stream into a picture and then returning that to the function. So I probably won't go into any more detail than that, other than all of that is included in the sample database. So if you're curious about how it's doing all of that, you can go in there and take a look at that. This was code that originally was adapted from this CMVBtalk.com website, which I'm not even sure is still out there anymore. You might have to go to the Internet Archive to see what that original page was. I think I added the support for PNG conversion as part of that, but you can see there's a bunch of low-level stuff that's happening in order to get this whole thing to work. But at the end of the day, I'll show you how easy it is to actually do that. So this is what's happening. We're extracting the raw bytes using GDI plus to convert the PNG. All right, so let's go out and actually grab an icon. Okay, so if we go in here to our print preview toolbar, I didn't have a PDF icon and I wanted to just use what was included in Office. So right now I'm using a PowerPoint icon because it's got a P in it and it looks like a document. And if you don't know that that's the PowerPoint icon, it looks like it could be a PDF icon. So that's what I went with. But like I said, this could change with a different version of Office. And instead of having a P right there, it might just have a presentation, a slideshow or something, an easel. It might not look anything like a PDF in the future. So let's see if we can get a different icon for that. So here's that icons8.com. And I just did a search for PDF. I've got this PDF icon here. I'm just going to switch to another browser to see if it's going to load better. Okay. Not sure what was happening there, but we're going to go with a custom size. We're going to make it 32 by 32. Okay, so the reason it did a zip file is because I had the 16 by 16 in there as well, which actually is not a bad thing because I'll show you what I tend to do is, these are pretty small, 665 bytes for one file. That's only 407. So in total, we're talking about 1K total. So I'm going to copy the path. Okay, so it took that. By default, it's pulling this PNG extension off there, and it's using just the file name part. If I go over to the there's the PDF that I just brought in. And we'll go ahead and bring in the 16-bit or 16 pixel one as well. So they're both in there now. All right, so now I'm going to go in and I'm just going to update the print preview ribbon. And we're going to go here. All right, so there's that. The image that we're using right now is the file save as PowerPoint PPTX. That's not really a great way to do that. So we're going to switch that out. Again, all I had to do was just copy and paste that in there. And we'll save that. Do a compact and repair of the database. And there's our PDF icon. Okay, any questions on the icons before I do, before I go into the last part about callbacks?
There were quite a few questions, although I think some of them have been answered. Chris Arnold asked about using MSys resources, i.e. shared images, but we discussed that earlier, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is yes, you can. And it might be easier to do that if you're not used to the raw data method that Mike said. Crystal mentioned about the fact that older versions of Access defaulted converting pictures to BMP. That's no longer the default option. But be aware of that if you're using, I'm not sure about 2007, if you're using an older version. And oh, hang on, same question there from Crystal. Does the picture property storage format for Access not affect XML since there is an iPicture format?
Yeah, so because of the way that I'm storing the raw bytes in there, and then I'm using the GDI plus API calls, Access doesn't see that as an image at all until it gets passed as an iPicture object into the ribbon via the callback. So to answer the question, the way I'm doing it, the picture property storage format wouldn't matter.
Okay, and Peter Cole followed up the point about MSys resources, because that's attachment fields. If you were doing this with record set code, you would need to use record set 2 and field 2. Interesting issue that occurred with Access version 2206 since withdrawn. But that's getting off the point there.
Right. So, and those are, and I think the picture property storage format, just reading through the chat as Crystal said that, and I do have a lot of applications that were written, pre-2007 that we've continued to support all the way through. And so a lot of those database level options haven't gotten switched over. I haven't had to really worry about it because a lot of this code predated that as an option. So I had already kind of built in some workarounds for it. So I'll try not to go too in depth here. So there's the 3 different callback functions that have an effect on what you see within the ribbon are the get visible, the get enabled, and the get size functions. And we were having a conversation before this started about how you actually refresh the ribbon. And so let me just jump right into the code and show you what I do there. All right, so as an example, I've got this form that I stripped out all the logic, but I use this when I'm switching my data links between different locations, whether it's different clients or whether it's production versus development. And so right now, let's assume that we're in a production environment and we want to switch to development. So now when we're in the development environment, we might want to be able to show some of the hidden windows. So I've got a hidden global window, and so I can show that and hide that window. And so the way that I do that, if I come in here, the after update event, I just have a call to refresh the ribbon. And if I jump to that, what it's doing is it's checking for this ribbon object. So how do we populate that ribbon object in the first place? There's a callback function. And I apologize for jumping around a little bit here, but right here at the very beginning of our custom ribbon, there's an onload attribute. And this is the callback function that gets called. when this particular ribbon is loaded. And so I'm calling RB load main ribbon, and it's because this is the main ribbon that's running the application. So when the ribbon loads, it's going to come in here, and it's going to pass me a ribbon object, and I'm going to store that ribbon object in a module level variable. And the other thing, the problem with doing that is that if the code gets reset for whatever reason, we're going to lose this reference. And so I also store a pointer to that object, and I store the pointer to that object in TempVars. And one of the nice things about TempVars is that it survives the program state being reset. I actually don't use TempVars that often. I tend to use a global form, but it's in this situation. What's nice about it is that I don't have to add a control to hold that pointer in the global form of every application where I want to use this ribbon. The only thing I would have to worry about is if the application I was using also had a TempVar called pointer ribbon object, but it seems unlikely. So then when we refresh the ribbon, then it checks to see whether or not that ribbon object is still valid. And if it's not, then it goes out, it grabs the address pointer to our ribbon object, and then it uses this MoveMemory call to take the pointer to that ribbon object, put it in the ribbon module level variable. And then what we do is we call the invalidate method. And what the invalidate method does is it basically just forces every callback function to run again. So for the most part, when you're writing your callback functions, you want to keep them so that they're low impact, that there's not a lot of work that's getting done. You don't want to have to do like an expensive database lookup. So you want to try and keep those as efficient as possible. But if for some reason you've got one that's really long, you can also call this refresh ribbon and pass it a specific control ID, and then it'll only run the callbacks for that control. So that if for whatever reason you do have an expensive callback that you just need to have in there, this is a way that you could get around that by just invalidating and forcing the ribbon to run the callbacks for an individual control. And with that, I'll happily answer any additional questions and stay as long as you want.
Thank you ever so much for that. That was really, really interesting. And I'm going to have to watch this at least once again to actually take it all in, even though I've made ribbons before. I don't do them often enough. Would anyone else like to come back in and ask any questions while Mike is still around?
Yeah, can I just ask a question?
Yes, Neil.
Yeah, just clarify, did you say that TempVars structure survives basically a debug reset?
It does. Yep. So if I do, so right now, if I call the refresh ribbon and I step through, all right, so the ribbon is populated, so it's not nothing, which is why it stepped over it. But now if I do a reset and I run this again, so now the ribbon object is nothing, but the TempVars.item still has the memory address of where it lives.
That's great. So that allows it to survive an untrapped error that you might have lurking somewhere in your application.
Right. And I think as I'm looking at this, that I probably hadn't, I don't know why that, yeah. So this might need to be a long pointer actually. So that might be something that, nope. No, I'd say it didn't need to be a long pointer. So I'm not sure what the overflow error was there, but
that's very useful. Thank you.
Thanks. A lot of very, very positive comments, Mike, about what you've done here. Another question from Crystal, and I think I know the answer to this myself, but I'll ask it anyway. Wondering if code can also define the QAT, quick access toolbar, because they're sort of related to ribbons. Would you like to answer that?
I think the answer is yes, but I'll let you answer that because I haven't actually done it myself.
Okay, now I was going to say I think the answer is no. So one of
I'll
us
defer to you because I think you've done more work on that than I have.
I don't know. I think certainly one of us is right.
There you go, Crystal. The answer is definitely yes or no.
That's a definitive answer for you there, Crystal. Any other questions from anyone?
So then the only other thing I would say then is that if you go to this website, nolongerset.com/ribbon, you'll see the some resources, a copy of the PDF, the slides, the sample database, and some further reading that I've, some other articles that I wrote. And then as I write additional articles about the Office ribbon, they'll appear here on this page. So you can check back from time to time to look for updates there.
Brilliant, Mike. Okay, thank you ever so much. I'm just going to take over the screen a second.
Sure.
I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you if there is a reason to do so directly on this. And if anyone wants to ask any questions later, but if I just drag this across, that was the page that you just showed on your website with this, which includes a copy of the PDF that you use, the presentation, and the sample database, and links to all the other articles you've done recently, but also on the Access Europe website, on the member dashboard, you can also download the files that Mike showed you today there as well, the PDF and the Access database. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Mike. Next month, we have Peter Cole. And Peter, some of you will be familiar with his work on Access themes, as well as on a 32 to 64-bit conversion tool that he's been working on for some months. And if Peter is able to turn his microphone on, I'd be grateful. And thank you, Peter. And if you could just give us a little bit of an idea about next month's talk.
Oh, I'm going to show a bit of an introduction as to what needs to be done to change from 32 to 64-bit. Now, I'll be showing my API viewer, which is an alternative to the one that RunDiBruin has, but it's an ACCDB, so people can change it. I'll also show a tool I've got which reviews an Access database or collection of databases in a folder and indicates how many declare statements there are in there, so that you can have an idea of what scale of project it is to update those. And then I'll be demonstrating the tool which I've been working on for many months, which actually does the update. It changes the declares, but it also actually fixes the code, the calling code as well. Still working on that. At the moment, working on bits which allow you to exclude some particular modules, because there will be some which is so obscure that can't manage to update. So we need to be able to do what can be done, but leave those bits out for manual updating, which I'll then include in the later versions of the updater.
Thank you ever so much, Peter. I'm looking forward to next month's session. And thanks once again to Mike Wolfe for another excellent session this month. See you all soon.